Welcome to THA Talks, for free thought and open minds. Hello, I'm Paul Obitelli and welcome to another edition of THA Talks, the alternative podcast show from the UK. Our talks include news, conspiracies, spirituality, the occult, science, history, art, philosophy, religion, and much more. If you'd like to check out our full archive, just go to www.thatalks.com to listen to or to download all our free content. And if there's anyone who'd like to contact us and give us some feedback, or maybe you'd like to recommend a guest for the show, you can email us at info@thatalks.com, or you can go to our website and contact us via the contact tab there. And don't forget, you can subscribe to the show via our RSS feed, and you can also find us on iTunes and Stitcher and many other podcast directories out there. Thank you all for tuning in again. It's good to be back. So wherever you are, whenever it may be, we appreciate that you've connected to us again here on THA Talks. For a guest that has been on the show before, it's a return guest, which is always interesting. And it's going to be another interesting one, believe you me. But first, there's a man that is back in town. He's been a bit busy, but he is back in town now for this show. And he's a surgeon, he's a dramaturge. And you know who I'm talking about, didn't you? David Parry.
That's at the end of a sunbeam, my mummy told me so. A sunbeam, a sunbeam. Oh, good evening, Mr. Obitelli, how are you?
I'm good. This is the second show I've recorded today, so I've been at it full time today, but you know, I love to do it, so that's all good.
Get to it.
Yeah. What about yourself? You've been very busy, and are you all dramaturged out yet?
Well, don't forget, I'm actually not the dramaturge for this one. I'm a mere actor.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, Victor Sobchak's remarkable Anglo-Russian theatre company, Artvic, I went to an incredible play last night. They put on the play by Bulgakov, Morphine, and it was one of the best versions of Morphine I've ever seen. Very, very impressive. I'm honoured to be working much more closely with them nowadays. Last time, of course, for Cincinnatus, I was creative director, but this time I'm an actor. I'm General Ivolgin in Dostoevsky's The Idiot. The only fun character in the piece. He's a bit like the sort of Russian Sir John Falstaff or the Russian Don Quixote. Very theatrical, and so it's a bit grim. But yeah, we're all having lots of fun, and of course it's on soon, so all guns are blazing.
Well, yeah, I'll be looking forward to checking that one out as well.
Welcome, young Obitelli. You are always welcome.
Well, I'm sure our listeners will be up for checking that out as well. But on to today's guest we've got the return of Dr. Mark L Mirabello, who came on last during edition 37. He's back now, and we're going to be talking about his latest book, A Traveller's Guide to the Afterlife. Those of you who checked out the last edition, it was a fascinating talk. We had a very deep talk with Mark last time, the afterlife, how much more interesting can you get? And it's going to be an interesting one. What are your views on this one, David?
Well, he's a true scholar in the traditional sense of the word, I suspect. It intrigues the spiritualist part of me, obviously. And, you know, the whole death literature. I mean, these are ancient traditions. They go back to the beginning of the human race. You know, the Ars Moriendi, as I believe they used to call it. And, you know, I'm sat here thinking about the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the Bardo, Thodel, who, of course, actually do start to describe what's happening post-mortem. And, of course, young Paul, you know I've got a thing about Emanuel Swedenborg, who spent 30 years mapping these areas of consciousness, he claimed, as a naturalist, as a sort of powdered wig and scholar of the period. So, this will be a fascinating talk.
Dr. Mark Mirabello, it's good to have you back on the show. How you been?
Well, thank you very much. Pleasure to be back. As we say in America, I got a second date. That's pretty impressive.
Well, last time you came on, it was a very interesting chat. We had a lot of good feedback from our listeners, so we definitely wanted to get you back on again. Since then, you've written a book called A Traveller's Guide to the Afterlife, which sounds really interesting. What have you been up to since the last time you came on?
Well, strangely enough, a lot of it's been because this is really the first time in my life I've had a major publisher put a book out, very large international publisher, and I've been involved in a lot of promotion work. And again, being on a show such as yours is very helpful, and it helps generate other, shall we say, gigs, so to speak. And in fact, I'm going to do a television interview in Boulder, Colorado between Wednesday and Friday. So very active, and of course teaching my classes. But this has all been a wonderful experience in terms of being on your program, writing the book, being able to share the ideas.
Great. I mean, it's. I remember the last time you were on. We obviously had a very deep conversation, and we had a lot of listeners that were sending in messages interesting about the subject. What's been the main inspiration behind this book?
That's one of the common questions I receive, and I think in my entire life I've always been focused on knowledge. I'm a historian, but I'm always interested mainly not what humans build, but what they think and what they believe. And this is the ultimate question. Now, I know in our society, in Western civilization, often the ideas of the afterlife, post-death existence are dismissed as basically another version of the Tooth Fairy or Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny. But I think that's a really immature point, because we should prepare for any eventuality. And we can't know for certain whether or not what happens on the other side. It's possible that the sort of free-thinking materialist atheist types are correct, but even if you're inclined in that direction, you should prepare. It's like buying house insurance or car insurance. And it really requires relatively little effort to master some fundamental notions. And I remember saying, I've said this in virtually every time I talk on this subject, I'm often struck, again, this is a characteristic of the Western world, where highly educated people really are just virtually ignorant on fundamental notions about the other side, so to speak. And I also notice in the West, because obviously the Judaic-Christian heritage, there's a tendency to be really monolithic about all this and think, well, somehow there's a supernatural. If it does exist, it's tied to some sort of supernatural, omnipotent God, that we have an indestructible soul, and it's all tied to ethics. Basically, good and evil take you to various locations. And as I discuss in the book, this is possible. It's possible these ideas are true, but we know about 3,500 known societies, and there's a wide variety of beliefs. And what's quite stunning, for example, is how many are not connected to a God whatsoever, or how they're not connected to ethics whatsoever, and indeed not connected to the idea of an immortal soul. The Egyptians, everyone knows, were really interested in the afterlife, but they did not think we had an immortal soul by nature. They believed, in a sense, salvation through magic, and that's what the so-called Book of the Dead, the Book of Coming Forth by Day, the pyramid text, the coffin text, are magical formula, if you will, to help the deceased navigate the dangers and survive. The Egyptians thought, death is not normal here. We can be killed, though, and death will happen the other side as well if we don't know the proper magical procedures.
Right. Do you come from the last time you were on was edition 37, it's quite some time ago, and I can't recall your own religion yourself. Do you have your own faith? Are you a Christian, or do you keep?
Well, in fact, I make it. In fact, in the book itself, and indeed, I teach a class on alternative religions at Shawnee State University here in the United States, and that question always pops up, and I sort of act like a Hillary Clinton here, and I dodge it. Avoid answering the question. directly at least. And there's a reason for that, because I view myself as a purveyor of knowledge, and it's important not to contaminate the knowledge by putting a spin on it. Now, I know there's a really venerable tradition in the British press, which sadly we don't follow here, where everybody knows up front that the Guardian tends to be more to the left, the Times is more to the right. In the United States, everyone always pretends to be impartial, even when they're not in the media and in the press. But I really make a serious effort. And in fact, throughout my life, I've been constantly exploring new ideas. And in fact, I was, like most Americans, raised in a sort of traditional Christian background, but I've really, I've not, shall we say, repudiated that by any means. But I think I've added some new ideas and new explorations and so forth. And as you know, I even have a work on pagan movement, the Odin Brotherhood.
Yeah.
And I get that constant question, am I in that? Well, the trouble is, answering that question is a real member of it would not be able to answer yes or no, because it's arranged in a kind of secret society set up. And that represents a really venerable mystery tradition, which again is widespread. And I talk about these in the book. Perhaps best note be, for example, the Orpheus or Orphic cult, so to speak, in ancient Greece, where the person receives certain passwords and information that will help navigate the next side and take him to a better place. Which reminds me, because of so much ignorance about other traditions in the United States and, in fact, in the world, we have the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, and you can walk into any, they have all these Christian bookstores in the United States, and you can walk in any one, and they always have really hate literature directed towards the Mormons and the Jehovah's Witnesses. It's always been there. And these works on the Mormons are talking about, for example, Joseph Smith, the founder, they view him as a prophet. The Mormons in their various initiations in the temple receive secret hand grips, for example, and secret procedures. And right away you get these American critics saying, well, they stole this from the Freemasons, and this is just a rogue religion out of control. No, it's not. The idea of mystery procedures is really core to the human experience. And I think, regrettably, if the Vatican had studied history more effectively, they would have never had Vatican II, because they tried to open up the Catholic Church to the public and shine light on various ancient traditions and mysteries, and they've been essentially in free fall ever since. Most of the growth comes in the Third World, and it's declining in the West rapidly. And of course, since you're stationed in Europe, you know the state of the churches there, Christian churches. Yet oddly enough, non-traditional religions are just thriving, such as there are now more witches in England than there are Methodists, which is quite stunning, this transformation. So, but again, I'm dodging the question, but I really imagine me just walking through a field and picking all the fruit from many different sources. And I do have certain inclinations, but I try not to preach in the work or in the classes, so I sort of avoid a direct answer to that.
Well, sometimes if you teach people with a mask on, it means they're listening more about what you're saying rather than who you are. So I understand that perspective. I think that can be very effective, because people can be very judgmental. If you got your own beliefs, they can just think that you're, as you say, a preacher. I totally understand that. Do you, in your book, do you go into the Norse? I mean, you've obviously written about the Odin Brotherhood in the past. Do you go into like the Norse and the Germanic pagan philosophies on afterlife? Because they obviously had a lot of sort of the realms, the nine worlds and layers, and they had a belief in the afterlife. Did you research that deeper at all?
Well, I do address it, although because I'm dealing with so many traditions, it's virtually every tradition I'm talking about, and I try to be as comprehensive as possible, it's very precise. I just mention it and make it very clear. In fact, my interest was to convey as much information in the most precise way possible. So, for example, I do make references to the Odin Brotherhood briefly, and I talk about what the idea, and the reason I did, of course, because there's a whole cluster of traditions, which again a lot of Westerners aren't familiar with, where oddly I say in the Judaic Christian tradition, the way and manner of death become really important. And you have this notion in traditional Germanic lore of for example, warrior's death takes you to Valhalla. Now, one thing I make very clear, and this is, again, very common in many of these warrior traditions, they have the hardcore that you must die in battle against overwhelming odds, be the hero. But typically, there's a way to game the system. And in fact, one of the things I do in the book endlessly is give you the way to, shall we say, short-circuit the system and get the results. And within the Odin Brotherhood, there's an initiation procedure which is clearly based on the marking of the spear, described by Snorri Sturluson, and it's basically devoting yourself to this tradition. And the belief, it's not emphasized because really up front, because they don't want a bunch of people just doing this just to sort of do it, but it's the equivalent of death in battle. The idea that, so in other words, and again, in our modern culture, I'm a college professor in, frankly, Midwest America, which by British standards is the middle of nowhere. The odds of me dying in combat are pretty remote, unless I move to Chicago. A little joke there. But there are these initiation procedures, which reminds me too, for example, in Buddhism, very similar notion, you have the diamond vehicle Buddhism, which is a form of right-handed tantric Buddhism. And the whole idea is to basically, again, well, I hate to say this, not to be cynical, but it's gaming the system because it can give you release in one life and various procedures, whereas most people would require literally millions and millions and millions of lives. Because as you know, in the East, there's the idea of the endless nature of both the universe and, frankly, even of the humans, or I should say of entities. We're not always humans. We come back as gods and animals and hellish beings. But Diamond Vehicle Buddhism, which is represented by the Dalai Lama, has certain procedures to kind of avoid that. Go directly to, I should say, reversing it from the Monopoly game. You get to go to, shall we say, a better place and collect your $200 on the Monopoly game. So again, I deal with this. So your original question, I do address it, but very straightforward and very simply. One of the things I say early on in the book, and I was fascinated by this, in ancient Egypt, there is just absolutely they never discuss these ideas with a sense of mysticism, and they're very matter of fact. And they just say, this is what it is, and this is what you do. And there's a tendency, especially in the sort of New Age movement in the West, just to complicate stuff. I mean, these people writing 400-page books on absolute truth, and you're one with the universe, and it's all, to me, that's all rhetoric and fluff. And I try to cut to the core on these notions.
Right. Yeah. No, it's fascinating stuff. David, I get the feeling he's itching to get involved in this one. What do you make of this, David?
Well, I mean, it's a sheer joy and a pleasure to have Mark back. So, sat here, I suppose I'm listening to thoughts again I had when John Hick gave a lecture at King's College London, where I was an undergraduate at one point. He spoke alongside Keith Ward, and I can't remember at that time whether he'd actually written the book or said he was going on to write the book. He wrote a book called Death and Eternal Life, which I'm sort of hearing echoes of here. So that's very interesting. I must admit, Mark, I find there's so much more to the mystical tradition than just fluff. I'm thinking at the moment, let's start with philosophy. I mean, even Schopenhauer says there's an immortal side to us, an immortal part of us as beings, and spends a great deal of time arguing the point. I mean, would you find that an irrelevant pursuit or unhelpful?
Actually, I should probably correct myself there, because I was just talking about how I try to present every tradition in a fair way, and I used, as you say, the word fluff. What I meant was not so much the ideas themselves, but some of the writers on the tradition. I was talking about confusing the issues. there is an element of, again, I'm not trying to disparage the idea of the mystery movements and the idea of spiritual development and cosmic evolution and so forth. But I just meant some of the purveyors. It's just as if, well, again, they're often profound ideas, but you have bad professors in universities teaching them, being unable to describe. I guess that's what's coming out as my background, because I just dislike college professors who take the simple and make it complex. Yes, that's what I was referring to. Now, there are, as you say, a number of traditions, and it's very possible, when I said about the idea that we may not have, for example, mortal soul must seek it, there's a whole endless notion of that there are such traditions. You find it in Hinduism, you obviously find it in Christianity, you find it in Islam, that in fact there's that great line in the Gita where Krishna is talking to Arjuna, and it's about there's the future battle, and Krishna tells Arjuna, you can neither die nor kill, because when you kill someone in battle, of course he's from the warrior caste, that's his nature, he must fight. When you kill someone in battle, they really are not killed, and when you are killed in battle, you really don't die. So again, I should not have dismissed these traditions. I was just meant the people that sometimes teach the profound ideas. And you used to get the same thing in physics, you get the same thing in biology, you get the same thing in astronomy, where they'll just anyone in the West now how many times I've seen when they're discussing quantum physics, and some physicists will make the comment that nobody understands this in the world, or nobody understands relativity theory. It's ridiculous. These are pretty simple notions. Yeah. And they're trying to wrap themselves in the sort of cloak of mystery. And I should mention, ancient Egyptian priests, I had earlier said that they were very straightforward in their writings and scribes, but they did monopolize the information. They were the technicians of the sacred. Some estimates are there may have been just in the golden age of the Old Kingdom, when the pyramids are being built, perhaps as low as 500,000 people in the Nile Valley, in an fertile area the size of New Jersey, United States, and perhaps 15,000 literate people at that time. That's it. In ancient Egypt, at the golden age of the Old Kingdom, when all the great pyramids are constructed. And they clearly were, since so few could read the hieroglyphics, they were monopolizing. And I'm trying to, again, shall we say, bring it to the public. Now, earlier I disparaged the Catholic Church for, in a sense, or criticized for opening up the mysteries to the public, but in that particular tradition, I think it hurt them. But I think if we give the key information to the informed public, because, again, most people are going to eat, drink, and be merry their entire lives and aren't going to pay attention to what we're even discussing, which, oddly enough, in some traditions, we had this so-called seer in the United States in the 19th century named Davis, and he claimed he was having visions of the other side and so forth. And this is, again, found in Gurdjieff's traditions out of Russia, that if people spend their lives just sort of eating, drinking, copulating, and defecating, they're going to disappear when they die, there's nothing really there. And according to Gurdjieff, and even according to Davis, they have to develop, in the case of Davis, the spiritual side. In the case of Gurdjieff, it was sort of the will and knowledge. It's important to devote at least some time to this. I'd be really curious if our most informed quantum physicists turn into basically ozone and fertilizer and disappear from the universe after they die, because they couldn't take a few moments to study some of these traditions.
Gosh, that's so well put, and I think I'm stealing the phrase "technicians of the sacred." That's an absolutely beautiful way of putting it.
Well, thank you.
Well, Mark, I mean, no, you're a scholar. I'm sure you know what I mean. Universities aren't exactly awash with them these days. But soul making, that's caught my attention. I suppose I'm some sort of a incurable Spinozist at the back of it all. Which makes your book, and say someone like Swedenborg, who's a man I'm obsessed with in many ways, makes it confusing and interesting at the same time. I mean, your book is called A Traveller's Guide, I note. And certainly Swedenborg, who was a naturalist in his day and spent 30 years applying those techniques to his visions of the other side, would have claimed to be an explorer in that sense. I mean, can you explain to a diehard Spinozist, in outlook on these matters, what some sort of traveler's guide would be in this case?
Well, by the way, I should mention, I shouldn't take, because you, in a sense, complimented the title. It's one of those things when you sell the book in the contract, they gave the right to change the title. So that was I did note, I think it was an improvement, because my titles tend to be, shall we say, more in the male tradition and kind of cutting, hard-edged. And in fact, I originally had the term in the title of the skeleton key, basically the other side, because that's a master key. Although I notice when I ask students in classes, nobody seems to know what that is anymore. And if I bring it up, they just think it's from a movie from 10 years ago, a horror film. Now, it's also interesting. You mentioned both Spinoza, of course, the Jewish philosopher, 17th century, and then Swedenborg in the same breath, because it's interesting that Christians tend to view themselves as a continuation of Judaism. And in a sense, I don't really get into this in the book, but it appears to be, and I'm stealing other scholars on this notion, kind of Hellenized Judaism. It's kind of sort of, you mix Judaism with Plato equals Christianity. And I think it's interesting to me, and I talk about this in my classes, not in the book, how often Christian clergy in particular assume there are things in the Old Testament that really are not argued at all by the Jewish rabbis. And it's because people are inserting things and they're not really talking to each other. Now, but getting back on the two principal notions, I also fascinated by Swedenborg, and I do discuss him in a couple sections of the work, because, again, he has such a matter-of-fact description of the other side. And I think among Christian writers, my personal opinion is, I don't say this in writing there, but he's by far the most intriguing, because again, he was originally a scientist in Sweden, and he's based in a nobleman, highly educated, and he basically presents this really consistent version of the other side, where everything ties together. And the notion, I've always been intrigued by the idea that he argues, obviously there's a one God, although he talks about what is called by historians, he doesn't say this, but it's called modalism, that the same God appearing in different ways has led to the notion of a Trinity. But in fact, Jesus and, for example, Yahweh or Jehovah are actually the same entity. Just like a man can be a father and a son, as well as a grandfather on earth, that's what's happening there. So one mystery solved. How could this sort of curious notion of a Trinity? It goes back to monotheism. And, of course, the Christian idea of a Trinity violates the first commandment, according to Jewish rabbis, who are really insisting on the oneness of God. And then the notion that God he depicts as this loving entity that really doesn't send anyone to hell, or for that matter to heaven. That on the other side we die, and most of us go to what's called the world of spirits first. That's where we see dead loved ones and friends, but then based on our ruling love. And I always found that idea really interesting, because everybody does have a ruling love. It trumps everything else. For some, it's really noble and high. For example, in my book, the quest for knowledge is an important ruling love. For others, frankly, it's just power. It may be lust. There are all kinds of notions. It may be service to humanity, as the Buddhists call it, being a blessing to the world. There are all kinds of people that devote their lives to this. But then, in the next side, based on your ruling love, you gravitate. For example, those who are good gravitate naturally to a heaven, which he describes with houses and a sky and beautiful people engaged in. They even have a government there they set up. And then he has these wonderful in the sense of interesting descriptions of hell, which literally is described as some kind of urban slum. It's dark, it's filthy, and there's constant crime. These are all the damned, and they're robbing, they're raping, they're torturing, they're killing. And Aleister Crowley, of course, the famous British occultist, once said that he just didn't want to go to the Christian heaven because, frankly, he liked sluttish women and, shall we say, drugs and alcohol and so forth. He thought he'd be happier in hell. And what essentially Swedenborg is saying, that's where Crowley's going. And he's happy there because the wicked people enjoy their wickedness. That's one of the problems, I think, with Western notions of, shall we say, reforming the criminal. We forget that some people are just love what they're doing and would be bored by a traditional Christian or what is typically described as a moral lifestyle. And then Swedenborg gives the example, which I discuss in the book. It's like a frog. If you take a frog to a bright, beautiful meadow in the summer, he's miserable. He wants the swamp. He wants the slime. He wants insects buzzing around that he can feed on. And so according to Swedenborg, an evil person actually is unhappy in hell and gravitates towards the hellish slum on the other side. And, of course, the good are not going to go there at all, just like we tend to run our interstate highways around dangerous neighborhoods in the United States. This is what happens in the other world. And he's got this really consistent point of view. He also solves, which I think most, or at least addresses it, what most Christian theologians really don't deal with, is the nature of eternity. If you do go to a heaven or a hell, because if you spend an eternity, for example, in a paradise, wouldn't that ultimately corrupt you? If you stories of the wealthy who start out as really good, noble people who become monsters by the end, because they have endless power and they have all this money and they can indulge in every possible vice. So they start to get bored with traditional sexuality and get involved in maybe even heinous acts and so forth because they can. This is often characterized as tyrants who rule nations. In fact, of course, there could have been secondary causes, but the young Henry VIII, who was athletic and good-looking and charming, ultimately degenerates into a monster, killing perhaps 50,000 people in England. And this happens all the time. Well, Swedenborg addresses this because if you are in heaven for literally an eternity, and even millions and millions of years, wouldn't you ultimately be not the same person? You'd be altered after all this time. And he basically argues there's a timelessness to heaven and hell, that there's no passage of time as such. And I think when we discuss ideas of eternity and infinity, we have to deal with these really notions. And I think he addresses it effectively. I think there's some other traditions that do as well. And in fact, I think some, again, traditional religions are quite effective at this.
Gosh, I mean, there are two things I need to ask you based on that masterly exegesis of Swedenborg. Surely Swedenborg is some type of anthroposophist at the end of the day. I mean, all that talk of the great man, the grand man, and, spirits gravitating to the correct portion, organ of the grand man. Do you think it's fair to say he's an anthroposophist in some sense or other?
Actually, it's interesting because that idea is found in all kinds of traditions. We find it in the idea that as above, so below. And if you study the man, you understand the cosmos. And if you understand the cosmos, you understand the man, or in this case, human. And we also find, oddly enough, in Jainism, which is obviously an Eastern religion in India, they portray the loka, that's the entire universe, which, by the way, they include also the gods and people at there are 4 levels of you can come back as, hellish beings, gods, and so forth. They include these entities in their universe, unlike the West, which if we believe in the universe, most, again, materialist types act like, well, heaven and hell are actually in it, or the dead, or if there's a God, he's not actually in, he's somehow either in another dimension or some spiritual realm that doesn't really connect. But they view, the Jains view the entire loka as a great man. In fact, we're roughly at the center. And oddly enough, in Jainism, there are more gods than humans here in the universe, which is interesting, because keep in mind, they don't worship gods. You can come back as a god in your various lives, but the whole goal is to escape the endless rebirth and basically cleanse yourself of all karma, which in Jainism has a physical aspect. We don't see, literally, the soul becomes weighed down by various bad actions, and frankly, actions in general. And then if you cleanse yourself, you become crystal-like, and you rise to the top of the loka, and you're plunged in infinite bliss, knowledge, and perception. But the idea that Swedenborg talks about, I think he is, as you asked, and I think that's a legitimate tradition found in many traditions. It sounds odd to Westerners, this idea of the universe shaped like a human, even though you get these oblique references like in the Old Testament, Genesis, God makes humans in his image and likeness. And by the way, for the record, we're pretty certain that the original old ancient Jewish people thought God had a face and a body and hands. When they referred to the hand of God, they mean it literally, which, again, oddly enough, that's an idea resurrected by the Mormons. They say God literally has a body. And we tend to think our modern idea is we're in this endless universe of galaxies and so forth, and it seems unusual, but I, again, remind everybody that this is a recent conception of the universe, and it may not even be true. I know that sounds curious. In fact, if you took a college class, you mentioned you're at the University of London, if you took a college class in 1900 and you said there were other galaxies, they would have flunked you because they thought that was a ridiculous notion. It had been proposed that what they called island universes existed, but they rejected it and thought everything was a part of the Milky Way. It's only really from the 1920s, this idea of all these galaxies. In fact, now we're talking about billions and billions of galaxies out there. But we have no idea what we're looking at. I love this image. I give it in the book of the Hindu notion. We're like frogs at the bottom of a well, and the frog sees the slimy walls of the well. He looks up and sees the circle of sky above, which becomes bright and then dark over the day and night, and he thinks that's the entire universe. And we're getting, even with our instruments, we're getting these glimpses of what appears to be eternity and infinity, but it may be misleading. It reminds me, there's the concept they've discovered called the gravity lens. They notice that there are certain things that are reappearing on opposite sides of the sky. And apparently, they explain it as a gravity effect. We're literally looking at some mirages, that some of the things we're looking at aren't actually there. Created just like you see in the desert, you're dying of thirst, and you see a spring or a town over in the distance, and then when you approach it, it's gone. The gravity lens effect, if it's real, is apparently creating these imaginary things. So we don't. It's very possible that the entire cosmos does has the shape and then of a human. Now, again, it's not, that would be laughable to an astrophysicist, but we really don't know. And which, by the way, again, I don't mention this in the book, but there are these really curious myths that exist in the modern West, and they're quite recent. And nobody even questions them by and large. It's the idea that happiness is the aim of all humans, that humans are essentially good, that all history is progress, and everything is matter. And we don't know if any of those are true. And I think because we tend to cling to them, and when I say myth, I mean it like the way the Germans mean it. It's an idea. It doesn't matter if it's true or false, but helps us to orient ourselves in the universe. And they're in every field. We have them in economics, you have them in political science, you have them in history, you have them in physics. But we have to break through that and realize there may be some other traditions. There may be more than matter. That history obviously is not progress. You see in Hinduism and Jainism and Buddhism the idea, this endless cycle of first progress and then decline. By the way, I've often been intrigued by the Eastern idea that, because in the West we blame humans for why we're in kind of a bad condition. Eve eats the apple, then Adam eats the apple of knowledge, the tree of knowledge. But in the East, it's a design flaw. Humans are created with hunger in Hinduism. That's where crime comes from. And in the Hindu universe, as it ages, it becomes corrupt. It also happens in Jain universe. But then after a purification, it's renewed again. which oddly enough is also found in Odinist traditions, that at the end there's this Ragnarok where the gods, if you will, most of them die in a final battle, and then the universe is renewed. But by the way, it's interesting, I notice some Westerners, because when they hear gods die, they're shocked by this. Like, well, okay, who could honor a god who's going to be killed? But in the circle of time, Odin, who's the first to die at Ragnarok, will return. And all these gods return. And in fact, oddly enough, it was really annoying, and I hate to mention this on your program, but I was observing these debates on Wikipedia articles on the sort of Germanic paganism page, which they now named heathenry. And there was some guy who clearly knew what he was talking about, was trying to say, well, these gods don't ultimately die. And they expelled him from the site. He was not able to edit because someone kept saying that, first, that the Odinist ethical system is very similar to Christianity, which is ridiculous, and also that the gods die forever. But again, nothing dies forever. That's a classic Indo-European notion. The only exception seems to be Persian traditions and Zoroaster. But even there's a final purification. Everybody is saved. So it's interesting to me how these same ideas pop up. Now, again, I've wandered off the initial point on Swedenborg, but the idea that the universe is a great man is always intriguing to me. And by the way, I should mention that people don't realize how little we know. Another interesting idea, if our galaxy were the size of a dime, what we're observing is only 4 miles out in terms of radius, if our entire galaxy were the size of a dime. We could just be very, very small. The idea that we're in a very large universe, we could be very small, and this sounds peculiar, but I don't say it's true. We could basically be some kind of ant farm. Wouldn't it be curious if we send some kind of stellar craft out in the distance and it runs into a glass wall, in the 23rd century? Who knows?
Mark, never stop wandering off. It's my great wish that we share a platform one day. I think this is Paul Obertelli's chance to come back in. Paul, my dear, what do you think of all of this?
Yeah, no, really interesting stuff, and it's been great having you back on again, Mark. I just wanted to ask, with this new book, have you actually indulged in any science and any quantum physics? We've got a guest that comes on regularly on the show, Anthony Peake, who's got some fascinating research about the nature of reality, and has written about the possibilities of how things can be related. These discoveries can be related to the afterlife and so on. Have you actually done any research yourself on that and indulged in that on this book?
And in fact, no. And I probably should have been fair. Once again, I seem to be this afternoon. Well, it's this afternoon here, where I'm in the United States, evening where you are. I don't know why I keep coming off. I keep saying how broad-minded I am and I like to share information fairly, and I keep going after some of these traditions. Must be the Sunday afternoon experience here. To tell the truth, I've always found, for example, I just read generally. Since I'm not an expert in this, I will read what I find articulate versions of the current theories in science. Again, I think it's very important that someone who mainly studies religious thought also study scientific thought. In fact, I have a history of science course that I teach at Shawnee State University. But what I normally do, and I think this is the problem, I think, again, not to criticize the scientists, but they tend to be really bad historians. And most works written by scientists on the history of science, remember we talked about, I just mentioned the myth of progress in history. They describe it as the rise of modern science, as if somehow we have the best information possible now, and how do we get from A to B? And they tend to leave out what essentially were the mistakes. Although it's possible the mistakes that they're leaving out are actually the proper ideas, we simply haven't recognized them yet. Quantum, and again, I don't mean to, and again, I'm no way an expert on this, but they didn't understand in the early 20th century. First, there were still people denying atomic theory in 1900, leading scientists Ernst Mach, a noted scientist, denied that atomic theory even was true. And one of the problems is they couldn't describe why an atom didn't collapse, because you had these negative electrons and positive protons in the nucleus. Why didn't the electrons simply fall into the nucleus? And they, again, when they were teaching their classes in 1900, they wouldn't tell the students that, but they were puzzled by it. And in quantum physics strikes me at times as almost, well, it doesn't collapse because it doesn't collapse. And they talk about, well, the electrons, you can't really predict where they are. Perhaps they're moving into parallel universes, perhaps the spontaneous motion from A to B without moving in the space in between. And it seems to me is they still don't understand how all this works. And they're kind of just saying, well, it works because it works. I've always been intrigued by the idea that everything is idea. And I think, I mean, I mentioned this, I don't emphasize it in the book, but I certainly mention it. It's again called non-dualist thought in the East. It's called idealism here, although we don't have the pure form they do in the East. And it's the idea that everything is thought. There really isn't a distinction between matter and energy and the mind. It's because everything here is thought. And Sir James Jeans, I may have even mentioned in the earlier program, because I often give this quote, he was a prominent British scientist near the end of his life, gave these famous lectures in the 1930s. And by the way, what's really interesting is how clear they are, in contrast to modern scientists who are often convolute. Jeans is just very clear. He mentions near the end of his life that more and more the universe is appearing to be more of a great thought than a great machine. And I tend to be inclined to those notions, which could, now keep in mind, you may say, well, this matter really does seem real, and it's hard. But when you're in your dream last night, you were touching things and they seem real. In fact, there's this wonderful Eastern notion that the other side, if you will, is as real as the pleasure you feel in an erotic dream. That pleasure you feel in the dream is real. And we deny the dream state somehow as less important. But in traditional cultures, when you die, in fact, if you want to know what the afterlife is like, you were there last night. This is a widespread notion found among traditional cultures, the ancient Greeks and everybody else, that all sleep is at night is a temporary death. The idea is, though, you come back in the morning, you wake up. And what death will be is you won't come back. And what's interesting about the Greeks, they carry this typically ancient Greek, they're very logical. The only thing that really survives in the next side is what they call the psyche, which is actually the dream soul. So the person you're talking to right now and the person I'm talking to and the audience we're addressing or the people I'm talking to will not survive in the after death, but our psyches will. Everything we were in last night in sleep. And obviously that'll make the afterlife roughly the way we were in the dreamlight. You can fly there, and if you think something, you're there, a location, and you think something that comes into being. That's core to the Tibetan Book of the Dead, because they endlessly talk. It's a guide, and I notice it's constantly misunderstood by some Westerners because they can't get rid of this real, unreal distinction between this world and the dream world. The Tibetan Book of the Dead says we're in the Bardo state 49 days and nights, and everything that happens to you is coming from your mind in a sense. Now, they don't use that term, but from your mind, the contents of your mind. And, for example, when you first die, well, you have the clear light of the void, which most people will shrink back, then a secondary experience that most people will be kind of shrinking back. And then you start to see these beautiful entities, which the Christian will see angels or the Christ, the Muslims will see archangels or perhaps Muhammad, and Buddhists will see Buddhist entities and Hindus, Hindu entities. But the Tibetan book that says, do not be drawn by this because they're not really there. And then you'll start, as the progress goes on, if you don't escape from the Bardo state, and there are various techniques to do that, you will start to see horrified entities, demons, what appear to be demons, and things that are ripping off your head and tearing out your intestines and gnawing your body parts in front of you. But the Tibetan book that says, do not be afraid, this is from the contents of your mind. Do not be drawn by the beautiful, do not be repulsed by the ugly, do not be drawn to what appears to be the pleasurable. Do not be afraid of what is horrifying. And if you keep calm, you go to a better state. And the entire book is about doing it, how to do this. Now, what's interesting is when a Westerner if he sees Jesus on the other side, it's all in his mind. Well, they're not trying to say Jesus doesn't exist. Just that your encounter there is from a dream. Just like you can dream about a loved one tonight. That doesn't mean the person doesn't exist. And when a Westerner hears that it's all a dream state in the Bardo state, they're saying, well, that's kind of not important. Well, the Buddhists say, Diamond Vehicle Buddhism, well, all Buddhists, in the sense that, or at least Mahayana Buddhism, that this world is a dream. It's no more real than that one. And everything is a dream. And the whole point is to lucid dream, to guide yourself in the dream and also to wake up that you're in a dream. That's the key to escaping the endless cycle of rebirth.
It's also quite interesting because when you do dream, most of the time we dream loads all the way through the night, like lots of different dreams. But when we wake up, we normally forget them. So it's quite interesting the way it's kind of comes from a part in our mind that's easy to forget as well. And I think that I've always had the feeling myself that because you can forget those dreams, it's kind of I actually prefer it when I remember my dreams. If I'm going through a time and I'm not remembering my dreams, I feel it's probably because I'm a bit stressed and I'm too drawn to the three-dimensional world, and it's making me forget more about that part of my mind. And I think that's quite interesting. I think remembering your dreams is actually quite healthy. I think that's how I feel anyway.
I agree with you. And by the way, it's also curious, why do we forget the dreams? We must be wired in that direction for some particular purpose. Keep in mind, there are some cultures, like you find in the Amazon, who say that the dream world, in their case, is actually more real than this one. Now, the issue is, if we were wired differently, and let's say that you live this daytime right now, and then you go to bed tonight. Well, imagine if it were reversed, that you couldn't remember what you did during the day, but you remembered all your dreams. Now, that would cause, we'd say, some confusion on the planet, but it's kind of curious. Why is one remembered and one is not? There must be some kind of, it seems like almost a intentional design. It also reminds me, that's why Easterners say, because of the analogy between sleep and death, why you can't typically remember your previous lives. You're forgetting your previous lives just as you forget your dreams from last night.
Yeah.
And there seems to be the connection. But of course, in East, because you have billions and trillions of lives, it's not important to remember all these lives because there are so many. Again, the West tends to view everything which is really curious because we have the notion of an eternal universe and endless time. But most people seem not be able to wrap their minds about what, again, eternity really means. And if somebody is getting excited that they think they were Queen Elizabeth I in a previous life during reincarnation, a Westerner to seance will get really excited about this. Well, as the Eastern traditions say, we've had so many lives, everybody has already been everything. We've all been kings, we've all been gods, we've all been pirates, rapists, criminals, rape victims, and it goes on and on and on. I like the Jain notion in particular. Interesting in terms when I say I like it. We've never been created. We've always been here, and we will always be here. And the universe has always been here. The modern science, when they talk about cosmology and the Big Bang Theory, it clearly shows Judaic-Christian influence, even though they don't admit it, because they're still thinking in terms of linear time with a unique beginning. Now, some of them try to say, well, maybe this is left over from a previous universe that's a bit more sophisticated, but they still show in Western cosmology they're coming out of the Judaic-Christian tradition. They're not often aware of it, which, by the way, Darwinian theory is similar. There's absolutely no reason, in my mind, for biology to have a myth of origins, like how all the animals and humans got here the way they are. And I don't think most people realize what caused Darwin to be accepted readily in the 19th century, and he was, even among the churchmen rather rapidly. It's a myth that the Anglican Church was this fighting all this hostile rearguard action against science. But at any rate, it's because Darwin gave them, they thought, an explanation how it could happen automatically, that without the aid of any kind of God, that we could go from primitive life forms to advanced life forms because of this natural selection, survival of the fittest, which of course is a kind of tautology, survivors survive. And by the way, there's a great line, this is not in the work, sadly, but it was actually meant, it was uttered by someone trying to be satirical. But he said essentially what modern science is teaching us is hydrogen, given enough time, turns into humans. Now, that's what science is teaching. Now, it sounds curious till you think about it. They talk about the primal atom explodes. You have all kinds of plasma. Eventually, this cools, and you start to get these simple elements, hydrogen and helium. And then eventually you get the emergence, we're not altogether certain how it happens, but of planets around star systems. And then on planets, you get the emergence of a kind of biosphere, which eventually emerges from primitive life forms up to advanced life forms. And then you take it all the way to the end, and eventually you get humans evolving, all on its own. So in a sense, if you start with hydrogen, given enough time, it turns into humans. That's a really unusual point of view. And by the way, it reminds me, too, it no longer exists as a living tradition, but Gosala tradition in India. He suggested the entire universe is going through a cosmic evolution constantly, and including humans. That, for example, we were we were once dinosaurs. We were once one-celled organisms and so forth. And we have all this eons of existences, and eventually we evolve out to the end, and then it starts over. And by the way, Gosala taught that ethics meant nothing. You could do nothing to stop this. It's just a natural progress. Again, biology, in my opinion, just should be studying the current life forms. You really can't explain how they got here. Wallace, who co-founds evolutionary theory with Darwin, he's typically ignored and disparaged because he said there's 2 points where it doesn't work. He thought the origin of life and the development of humans, because humans are so far above animal forms. Now, again, biologists try to minimize this. I just recently saw in the New York Times, they were saying that cockatoos, that bird form, has the intelligence of a 3-year-old human. I don't know what kind of 3-year-olds they're talking to.
Well, it seems to be just make humans as meaningless as possible nowadays, doesn't it? And just that's what it seems anyway. Like animals are better than us, apparently.
Yes.
Yeah. Seems to be a lot of that mindset going around. You know, oh, humans are scum, animals are fantastic. Which I kind of know where they're coming from, but I'm not quite in that mindset. But David, do you have you got anything you'd like to chuck in here? Because we're running out of time.
Oh, just one thing very, very quickly, I suppose. Mark, what do you think of modern spiritualism?
Well, I'm, again, really intrigued by it. In fact, the end of the book, I give not only notions, I have a chapter on ghost inspectors and also on communications with the dead, so-called necromancy. Modern spiritualism, of course, emerges in the 19th century. It's especially prominent in the English-speaking world with the Fox sisters, and it also is prominent in the UK. It really receives some strong interest after World War I, when so many young men were being killed in the war, and the attempts to communicate with them. It's fascinating to me to try it, and in fact, one technique. And I actually briefly corresponded with her, was this Dr. Cardoso, who's this really prominent Portuguese diplomat from an aristocratic family. And she talks about what's called trance and instrumental communication. She has a book that's been translated into English on it, where essentially people using radios and indeed televisions to communicate with the other side. And what requires the effort, it usually requires months of effort. And then eventually some people reach the state. Now, again, what they're essentially doing is they're turning a radio, especially short wave, to white noise. And then they have a recording device in the room. And later when they listen to the recording, they're picking up voices. Now, most people say, well, that's just stray radio communication. Well, at some level, some of these people are able to carry on conversations through the radio. She does this. She makes it clear she wasn't really certain what she is talking to. It could be the dead. She seems to think it is, but said it could be some kind of other life form, some kind of other intelligence, some kind of telepathic communication. But they have really spectacular results. The Dr. David Ford Tana, somebody was tripping up on his name, if I remember correctly, from Oxford, I believe it was, recently passed away. He writes an excellent work on, in fact, all of his books are interesting, on the afterlife, and talks about this endlessly. So I think it's a really interesting, legitimate tradition. Now, spiritualism as such, though, joins Christianity with communication, which is odd because Leviticus actually imposes the death penalty for that. And I think most of these people aren't aware of it. The Old Testament is really hostile to the idea. We have a necromantic ceremony appearing in the Witch of Endor story where Saul summons the dead prophet, and it's all conducted in a really sinister background setting. But I think communication with the other side is interesting, fascinating. I do talk about it in the book at length.
Mark, you must come back on the show at some point soon. Paul, that's me done for the evening.
Yeah, it's been fantastic having you on again, Mark, and reminded me how much we enjoyed the last one as well. Is there anything you'd like to let our listeners know about before we wrap it up? Any events coming up that you'd like to let them know about, or any future works that you've got planned?
Well, in fact, this was my fourth book, and right now, strangely enough, I'm doing some light work on what may be a second novel. I wrote one horror novel, and but that'll be a long-term thing. But they can find information at my website, which is my name, Mark M-A-R-K Mirabello, MIRABELLO. That's a B as in boy.com. And it lists all the works, and strangely enough, this new work is generating I think there's a lot of interest out there. All kinds of, this is probably, I've lost track, probably the 16th or 17th podcast and radio interview I've done, as well as an upcoming television interview. And it's been fun. I hope I'm not boring people by now.
No, I'm sure you're not.
But I'll list them all, and I've got some upcoming. I've got also another podcast coming up next month, and then I have one the month after that, and again, television this week. But so they can find information on my website.
Right. Well, it's. I remember last time we spoke about some of your health issues you had, and I mean, it's good that you're sounding in good health. So.
Well, I still have it. I got a cancer issue and still have it, but oddly enough, it's kind of synchronicity. But I just received an email communication asking about this from one of these Odin Brotherhood people, and basically the argument was, he told me, and it's clearly how I view it, is we talked about death in battle. You die heroically, and this, in my case, since I'm a professor, I'm not going to be dying on a battlefield. I'll fight this enemy to the end. It does kind of, I'm not as, shall we say, as much energy as before. It's kind of curious if you have cancer patients out there. The treatments are worse than the disease. That's where you disturbs your sleep. Weight issues develop. You have to watch it because you get really hungry. They give you some steroids when you're doing this. Aches and pains and all the rest. Which reminds me, it's amazing. This is, again, I'm not criticizing medicine at all, but when I got sick, they tried to give you painkillers. And this is one of the problems with the Western world. I just like to tough it out. And which reminds me, one thing we do here, most of our people who die in the West die under drugs. It's to eliminate the pain, so they die out peacefully. And Tibetans say that's one of the worst possible things you can do because you tend to come back as an animal, which is viewed as a low life form to them and requires millions of lives to get back to the human level. Mm. Some people think it's be fun to come back as a cat or a horse, but it's going to require maybe 8 million lives to get back to human level. And it's the human level that can achieve liberation, not the animal, and oddly enough, not the God, because gods have too much bliss and power. Animals are too ignorant. It's humans that have the opportunity to escape from the endless cycle. But so with this growing drug problem we have of painkillers, especially in the United States, don't take them. So again, thank you for having me on your program.
That's great. Been an honor. Here's your help into all the work you've got laying ahead of you. That's kicking ass, definitely. Good luck with all the podcasts, and we look forward to the next time you can come back and talk to us again.
Well, by the way, in the closing, I should mention that I love doing with you two gentlemen because the British do everything well. You really do. And no matter what,
not so sure about nowadays.
The Americans often not as you're just really on target. Good questions. It's a British, European, but especially British. So thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, and we'll speak to you soon.
Okay.
Bye now. Thank you.
Bye now.
Dr. Mark Mirabello, and I knew that was going to be awesome. Very intelligent guy, great. That book sounds fantastic. What are your thoughts, Dave?
Well, I mean, he's the real deal, isn't he? I mean, he's what do they used to call them? An organic intellectual. Somebody where it's just natural to their nature. That's what he's meant to be doing. A fascinating talk about a subject, of course, that's central to all of us, whether we like it or not.
Yeah, it's thought-provoking stuff there. Definitely look forward to getting Mark back on the show. And we did go over a bit of time there, so I think that is all we got time for. We better wrap it up. Thanks to everyone for tuning in. Please let us know your thoughts on today's show. And we've got some really good guests lined up, so till the next time we'll be seeing you. Please keep telling your friends about the show, keep linking the show, and more importantly, keep downloading the show. We're going to be looking forward to the next one, where we hope you join us again. Speak to you soon. Take care. Bye.
Chazzy.